Bună ziua. Um, Today I want to talk about a book which is regarded by GPs as one of the best guides to how to be a GP. And the book is called A Fortunate Man, and it's by one of my favourite authors, John Berger. Here it is. Hope you can see that. It's my old edition. And it was published in 1967. Now, it's a collaboration. It's what we might call photomontage, a series of vignettes or essays tracing the life of a country doctor who is called in the book Sassel, John Sassel. His real name was Eskel, so he's been slightly fictionalized. And the book is a series of vignettes, as I say, by John Berger and photographs by Jean Mohr, a renowned photographer from, who lived in Geneva towards the end of his life. Its inception was John Berger and Jean Mohr went to Belgium and saw a similar work, and they felt they could do better. John Berger had been living in Gloucestershire near the Forest of Dean, and his GP was Eskel in the book John Sassel. And he wrote to him and asked if they could do a book tracking his cases and investigating his life. And Eskel agreed and invited them to spend 6 weeks with him, following his cases and then documenting them. Documenting would be a good term for this particular book. And what it examines is the role of the doctor in an area of, if any of you have been to the Forest of Dean, cultural, social and intellectual deprivation. So the poverty of the people he's dealing with are stark. And Berger famously said he was a storyteller. That's how he saw himself. He's a polymath, just as we were talking about Boris Vian the other day. He's a polymath. He was an artist, an art critic, a broadcaster, a novelist, and this book combines a lot of those aspects of his own work and adds Jean Mohr's extraordinary photography. For any of you who are keen photographers, you can almost immediately tell that Mohr uses a Leica camera to capture his images. And Berger said that Jean Mohr would be in a room or in a consulting room and would be invisible. That the patient and the doctor would be totally ignorant of his presence. He was able to take these beautiful photographs, and I would rank Jean Mohr with Cartier-Bresson and other users of Leica technology. What the book does is analyse the way that Sassel's work justifies his life, and how he brings a sense of perspective and a sense of caring to his patients and to the area. Rather tragically, we don't hear anything about Sassel's wife in the book, and I don't put that as a critique at all. But he was clearly very dependent on her. She died, I think, in the early 70s, shortly after the book. And tragically, Sassel himself, after a period of travel in China, committed suicide. So the irony, perhaps, of the title, A Fortunate Man, the story of a country doctor, quite how fortunate he was, is questionable, but clearly the value that he gave to his patients and the way that is narrated through the text, and more to me the interaction between the text and the photographs, makes this book an absolute masterpiece, and probably one of my favourite books by John Berger. Berger and Jean Mohr are both sadly deceased, but they reached ripe ages. I think John Berger was 90 when he passed on, and Jean Mohr was 93. And they collaborated on a further, I think a couple more times, Another Way of Telling, and I forget the other book. But Jean Mohr collaborated also with Edward Said, looking at the Palestinian, I think, refugee camps. And he said rather memorably that when he photographed children in those camps, a child's laughter somehow redeems the situation they find themselves in. So it's, thankfully, I have the original edition, but it was republished in, I think, 2015. So this book, A Fortunate Man by John Berger and Jean Mohr, is available for you to enjoy. And if you enjoy that, then perhaps it will be a way in to some of Berger's other work. I particularly enjoyed his Into Their Labours trilogy, where he recounts the stories from the Haute-Savoie region where he moved and spent, I think, the last 50 years of his life. To the Wedding is a very moving evocation of the AIDS crisis, and A to X charts the conflicts in Central Europe, in the Balkans. One of his final books is also very moving, Bento's Sketchbook, in which he analyses the thoughts and wisdom of Spinoza and attaches his own rather beautiful sketches and drawings throughout the book. It really is a very moving book, which allies the image to the text in a beautiful way. You probably all seen or heard of his television series Ways of Seeing, which you can see on YouTube, and really does the opposite of Kenneth Clark's Civilization. It analyses the social context of the paintings and looks at gender stereotypes as well. One final clip or book, which you can read the book or you can look at clips on YouTube, is Lying Down to Sleep, which he did with his daughter Katya, and that looks at the Camera degli Sposi, the bridal chamber in Mantua, in the castle in Mantua, and really opens up that whole chamber and explains what's going on if you lie down and look up. Mantegna has been a favourite of mine since looking at his painting of the Christ from an absolutely fascinating perspective, which is in the National Gallery. So if you have a chance to look at Mantegna, have a look at that. An unusual book, photomontage, reportage is I think what we could call it, and well worth a read. I'd just like to read you, I think, 2 paragraphs from it because they're so relevant for our current day issues. And near the end of the book, John Berger writes, "Is humanity as a reality and as an idea a point of departure or a point of arrival? I do not claim to know what a human life is worth. The question cannot be answered by word, but only by action, by the creation of a more human society. All that I do know is that our present society wastes, and by the slow draining process of enforced hypocrisy, empties most of the lives which it does not destroy, and that within its own terms, a doctor who has surpassed the stage of selling cures either directly to the patient or through the agency of a state service is unaccessible." That is so true for our current days. And then his final paragraph. The conclusion is inconclusive and simple. Sassel practices medicine. His practice perhaps corresponds a little to my description of it. Since we have as yet scarcely begun to establish a society which can assess his contribution socially, since we can only judge him at best by empirical standards of convenience, I can only end by quoting the logic by which he himself has to work, a logic which, for all its stoicism, has in it the seed of a great affirmative vision. Whenever I am reminded of death, and it happens every day, I think of my own, and this makes me try to work harder. Almost like Samuel Beckett, fail better tomorrow. And in a society where we've only just begun to realise the importance of key workers who are woefully underpaid, and we give nurses and care workers a clap and a badge, we should feel ashamed and feel reinvigorated that after this crisis we can perhaps review our priorities. Next week I'll be talking about some Romanian authors, because this is where I live and they have many great authors, and I'll talk about some authors you can read in translation. But it's our Orthodox weekend, our Easter weekend here, so I wish you all Paște fericit, Paște liniștit, la rivedere și mulțumesc, sănătate!